You are a atheist libertarian YouTuber. You got one or two more adjectives? I watched your channel trailer. You had a few more adjectives for yourself.
Yeah, atheist, libertarian, YouTuber, anarcho-capitalist, asshole sometimes.
I'm psyched to have you on because your videos are just great. You're clear, to the point, funny. I love what you're doing.
Recently, I've garnered some attention over a statement I made on Twitter. That statement being, I might be a fascist. I might be a fascist. I might be a fascist. I might be a fascist.
You're a libertarian through and through, fair to say?
Yeah, that's pretty fair to say.
You know, just leaving people alone, you know, just pursuing your own self-interest, non-aggression, you know, minding your own business, basically just a live and let live attitude. This is a very juvenile and simplistic understanding of what it takes to create a libertarian society. So, libertarian fascism, also known as anarcho-fascism or alt-capitalism, is a concept philosophy that's been around for a few years. The primary reason for this ideology's existence is to direct a defensible and sustainable libertarian framework, not socially liberal, physically conservative, you know, marriage equality, 420 blaze it bro. So you're probably wondering how an alliance between fascists and libertarians would be possible, or even considerable. The answer lies in the commonalities that libertarians share with fascists. Things like ethnic homogeneity or separatism within world borders.
A second graph shows the war, the conflictual aspect of this process. So these are different types of wars that have been fought over the last 200 years. This is always in percentage, so the proportion of different kinds of wars, of all wars that are being fought in 5-year periods. And you can see here on the very top, these are wars of conquest. Then the white ones are interstate, classical interstate wars, balance of power wars. And then you have this gray area, which is all other civil wars. And here are ethno-nationalist civil wars that are linked to nationalist principles of claims to nationalist principles of legitimacy.
Egalitarianism destroys organic competition and congregation. Hyper-inclusivity abolishes separatism and breeds tribal warfare. You know, things like multiculturalism. Socialized liberal commons, I think it's self-explanatory. I mean, do we really desire expanded universal ownership over scarce resources?
A brand of what's called anarchism in the United States, and to an extent in England, if you take a look at it, it's advocacy of the most extreme form of autocracy and oppression that has ever existed. The policies very quickly turn into concentration of power in the hands of unaccountable private institutions. American libertarianism is perfectly happy to support masters. In fact, it extols them. It's in favor of it. It wants no interference with the domination and control of people in the workforce, let's say. That's very counter to traditional libertarianism, either in Europe or, for that matter, in the United States.
The demand of communism is inherently authoritarian, whereas the demands of fascism are preferably authoritarian.
Authoritarianism is a term political scientists use for a worldview that values order and authority and distrusts outsiders and social change. And when authoritarians feel threatened, they look for strongman leaders.
Leaders who are punitive, who target outgroups, and who have a simple, forceful leadership style that makes them feel strong. And if you were going to grow that candidate in a lab,
I'm gonna bomb the shit out of them.
He would look a lot like Donald Trump.
When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their lives, don't kid yourself. But they say they don't care about their lives. You have to take out their families.
Authoritarianism is not, in and of itself, necessarily a partisan issue.
For most of this country's history, authoritarians were likely divided between the two parties. But now, only one of the parties really appeals to them.
What happened was the Republican Party started to embrace what it referred to as traditional values, and it stood against a series of major social changes in this country.
After initially supporting civil rights, Republicans began courting Southern white voters who opposed racial integration. They turned against the Equal Rights Amendment, denounced abortion, and later fought against same-sex marriage.
Our nation must enact a constitutional amendment to protect marriage in America.
More recently, foreign threats like terrorism have become major political issues, with Republicans taking positions that align with authoritarian fears and preferences.
So Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler, two political scientists, they tracked data over several decades, and they found that authoritarian voters were shifting into the Republican Party. So that means that when authoritarians become scared, when they become activated by a particular social change or issue, the Republican Party can't ignore them, and they are a ready-made constituency for a candidate like Donald Trump.
The means of using a tool to influence a common goal isn't synonymous with authoritarianism. A libertarian fascist society could very well use the tool of private property to influence a common goal of promoting capitalism and cultural preservation. Dissenters or threats to this common goal could be extinguished through economic disincentives or disassociation.
I mean, if you have private ownership of the means of production internally, it's essentially a totalitarian institution, almost necessarily. There's a group at the top, maybe a person or a group, they make the decisions, they give orders, people down the hierarchy get the orders, transmit them. At the very bottom, you get people who are permitted to rent themselves to survive. That's called a job, wage labor. And you get the outside community who's allowed to purchase what you produce, and of course they're very heavily propagandized to make them want to consume it even if they don't. So I mean, that's the nature of the system. It's kind of about as close to totalitarianism as you can imagine.
Leftists have unfortunately made it very clear that there are no more arguments to be made, that they will continue to push for more state infringements on our liberties, that they will continue to burden our children with more and more debt, that they will continue to push for social demonization of our views. This isn't about convincing the left to change their ways anymore, okay? We are well beyond the point of please no stepping, all right? This is about unifying a populist right-wing majority against you so that you and your political representatives and your corporate and academic institutions will be subjugated to the survival of Western civilization, whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not. And if you refuse to peacefully enter the realm of enlightenment, rationality, and non-aggression, well, then we get into the beautiful theory of Hoppian physical removal. The greatest lie that leftists ever sold free societies is the idea that democracy is a legitimate and effective means of peaceful conflict resolution among conflicting ideologies.
The black shirts saw themselves as the front line against the socialist threat.
You could not really be a regular member, if you were within the right age group, without being part of this militia. Now, in Italy, the black shirts were the basic core membership of the party. This was a kind of special party army or party militia.
Ovazza played his part by helping to destroy trade union offices in Turin. These fascist attacks on socialism often had the open support of the police and army, as the liberal government was seen as too weak to stand up to the communist threat.
But there was also some sympathy from the state, as fascism claimed it wanted to defend the state, bourgeois society, property, and patriotic values, all those values that socialism deplored.
The strongholds of this uncompromising fascism were in the cities of central and northern Italy.
Distruggeremo I comunisti che vogliono distruggere l'Italia!
The motto of the black shirts was "Me ne frego," I do not give a damn. They considered life cheap. just as it had been in the trenches. In Lombardy in December 1921, one of the most senior socialist leaders was kidnapped and beaten to death. Women and children were forced to watch to learn the fate of those who opposed fascism.
If you support the traditional family and freedom of association and nationalism and white identity and voluntary exchange and private property, the leftist street maggots call you a fascist. Anarcho-fascism is organic. Fascism is a political philosophy that deals with preserving the natural order. It's about bringing about an organic right-wing social order. There are other labels one can use to describe an organic right-wing social order. So for instance, right-wing anarchism, right-libertarianism, national anarchism, pro-white libertarianism, which I'll get into later. They can all be used interchangeably when discussing a right-wing social order.
You think a libertarian would be like, yeah, stick your dick in whatever you want as long as it's adult and consenting?
You're right, TJ. This would be the assumed libertarian position on sexual promiscuity, particularly thanks to the libertine degenerates, masquerading as left libertarians or market anarchists. Feminist sexual liberation has coincided with, if not directly caused, quite a few negative cultural phenomena, many of which are toxic to society. High STD rates, demonization of sexual responsibility, etc.
Der Verfall unserer Kultur, diese Welle und Verpestung unseres ganzen kulturellen Lebens, der Zersetzung unserer Literatur, der Vergiftung unseres Theaters, der Kino, die ganze Kunst, sie wird nun langsam vernarrt. Millionen unserer deutschen Volksgenossen nehmen gar keinen Anteil mehr.
If the natural order is perverted, like we see now, then societies become diseased. They spiral into chaos, disorder. You have poverty and crime and misery. We are in the beginning stages in the West of this cancerous process right now, brought about by the Jewish corruptors and their leftist collaborators.
The notion that sexual liberation should face no criticism from libertarians because it's voluntary is both mainstream and pathetic. Granted, it obviously should be met with aggression. I'm not arguing to brand thoughts in the public square with hot iron. The principles of libertarianism, free markets, private property, and self-ownership are not meant to be these, morally relative concepts, or optional. These ethics are non-negotiable. I'm not arguing to brand thoughts in the public square with hot iron. Now, every individual is endowed agency by their nature of being an individual. But if you're unwilling to resolve conflict via mutual respect for the agency of others, then your agency, your individualism, and in turn, your rights are forfeited. One positive trait of fascism that I think libertarians lack is a sense of loyalty or civic responsibility to creating a better society. If the only wisdom or intellectual gift that you feel motivated or permitted to contribute to the world is liberty, then you're kind of admitting that you don't care about the world. It may sound shocking to hear coming from a very principled libertarian, a fucking AnCap. I also believe that a free society is easily abused, and that in order to preserve the social order, we're going to need to ensure the survival of our demographics, not only genetically, but culturally and ideologically. Homogeneity doesn't really benefit a society if it's filled with communists. This would be, in my opinion, one of the strengths of libertarian fascism, securing a free society via collective investment and determination in the preservation of our principles. Whereas modern libertarianism is just about being a suicidal philanthropist, you know? If we just expand the commons and yield open borders to leftists, we'll have a free and peaceful society. Tolerating intolerance is no different than cucking immorality. Left libertarians and black flag anarchists may not overtly declare an opposition to a free society, but they're pretty damn useless when it comes to pursuing or maintaining one. If fascists are willing to assist in pushing back against this wave of cultural Marxism that left libertarians are complicit in endorsing, I mean, who am I to deny a soldier his rifle?
The local fascist bosses were not concerned with parliamentary procedures. They believed socialism could only be eradicated by force. The fascists didn't defeat the socialist councils in elections. They simply stormed the town halls.
Socialists have lost control of the town hall forever.
The fascist takeovers had a dramatic impact. By the end of 1921, the party had grown from 20,000 to over 200,000 members. And it tasted electoral success too.
Are you going to have a massive deportation force?
You're going to have a deportation force. I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
Testing people for authoritarianism is a bit tricky.
You can't necessarily just ask people, are you really freaked out by social change? Do racial differences unsettle you? Do you support strongman leaders? Because those are very sensitive questions and people won't necessarily answer them honestly.
So instead, political scientists ask people about something more neutral, their parenting preferences.
Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have: independence or respect for elders, obedience or self-reliance.
These questions seem like they're about raising children, but really what they're asking people is how much they value order and authority.
So when political scientists tested these 4 parenting questions against the behaviors that they knew authoritarians exhibited, they found out that the correlation was very close. It was very predictive, at least for white voters.
Using this 4-question test, Vox worked with Morning Consult in February 2016 to poll a large sample of likely voters.
Our results yielded a few really interesting things. The first one was that yes, scoring high on the authoritarianism questions was very predictive of support for Trump.
A political science PhD student named Matthew McWilliams has found similar results.
He's done 2 polls, both of which have found that authoritarianism is not only strongly predictive of Trump support, but that it seems to do a better job of predicting it than virtually any other factor.
We also looked at what authoritarian voters are afraid of.
On things like car accidents, or the risk of gun violence, or prescription drugs, there wasn't a huge difference between authoritarians and non-authoritarians. But when it came to threats associated with people, and particularly foreign people, authoritarians were much more afraid.
And we identified policies that authoritarians were more likely to support.
So authoritarians were much more likely to say, for instance, that the United States should use force rather than diplomacy when dealing with countries that threaten our interests overseas. And they were much more likely to want to sacrifice civil liberties in exchange for safety.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay.
Any threat to the natural order must be immediately thwarted, and any assault on the natural order must be defended with a great degree of ferocity and vigor. What are the perversions of the natural order? Well, the destruction of the traditional family, the nuclear family, monopolistic states, multiculturalism, open borders, abnormal behaviors and lifestyles, egalitarianism.
Peace through coexistence is rendered impossible.
So, libertarianism is fascism light? How can anyone possibly say that? When fascism is all about maximizing state power and libertarianism is based on deconstructing the state. Well, to an extent, I accepted that party line and also thought that equating fascism with U.S. libertarianism was rhetorical overkill. But then you need to examine the goals of professed libertarianism in the United States and its current Tea Party leaders in Congress and their plans for American society. As you may recall, the Tea Party movement began in 2009 after CNBC commentator Rick Santelli knocked Obama's plan to subsidize the mortgages of so-called losers. This is the rhetoric of social Darwinism, and has always been the hallmark of fascism. Santelli also described himself as an Ayn Rand, after the intellectual guru of the American libertarian movement.
That is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal. That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them.
What does that have to do with El Fascismo, Mussolini's ideal corporate state? And after all, Rand always stated she was opposed to fascist statism. But Mussolini himself recognized the connection. He subsidized the publication of her books and the 1942 Italian film production of We the Living. Rand's heroes are Nietzschean Superman, as in The Fountainhead, where Howard Rourke boasted he was the man who robs the thieving poor and gives back to the producing rich. And her hero John Galt in Atlas Shrugged flatly stated, and I quote, "The man at the top of the intellectual pyramid contributes the most to all those below him, but gets nothing except his material payment, receiving no intellectual bonus from others to add to the value of his time. The man at the bottom who, left to himself, would starve in his helpless ineptitude, contributes nothing to those above him but receives the bonus of all their brains." Now, as a real-life John Galt would know, the material payment, the excessive material payment that he gets for his services, enables him to buy everything and everyone in the surrounding society. Any good and service that's made or offered, any person from peon to president. This ideology not only permeates the libertarian movement as such, but is also the guiding light in its grip on the institutional structures of the United States. House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan and his Path to Prosperity is a case in point, where punishing the weak and rewarding the strong is a social Darwinist fiscal blueprint for rescuing the republic from its alleged crisis. And remember, these are the same folks who tell you that the U.S. is a republic, not a democracy, so let's keep it that way. The democratic state is what they seek to deconstruct.
Durch diese marxistischen Wirtschaftstheorien an sich und dann durch den Wahnsinn einer Steuerpolitik, der das Übrige noch besorgt. Und nun sehen wir, wie